Welcome to the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America's webinar with our very own Haroon Moghul, who serves as the Fellow in Muslim-Jewish Relations. I'm Maytal Friedman, and I'm the Muslim Leadership Initiative Alumni Director here at the Hartman Institute. I'm honored to be sitting here with Haroon, preparing to speak about his book, his evocative and powerful memoir, How to Be a Muslim, An American Story. I'm going to begin by asking Haroon a few questions, and then we will take questions from the audience. We're going to integrate questions that you asked when you registered and also questions that you can continue to submit via Facebook. Haroon.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
We've been colleagues now for almost 3 months, and during my first week on the job, I read your book. And yet, we haven't really had a chance to discuss it. So, I was first of all really appreciative of your honesty and candor when you wrote about even some of the most painful experiences in your life. And also, it really resonated with me, many aspects of the book. Your spiritual journey, your search for God and meaning, your grappling with family expectations and obligations. So I'm looking forward to actually having a chance to talk about it now, and in front of so many people.
How many people? So, that's a bit overwhelming and intimidating.
Yeah, I think
Not
it's a
too
lot.
many.
I think it's a lot.
Okay,
so why don't we just start with you telling us a little bit about why you wrote the book when you did.
So when I started being involved with Hartman, that was the first year of the MLI program, and that was in the summer of 2013, so just about 4 years ago. And I'd worked alongside religious and secular Jews for a long time, but that was my first deep immersion in a Jewish community. And many people at Hartman, I think, identify as modern Orthodox in some way, shape, or form. And there's this philosophy running through Hartman of taking the world seriously, as in secular reality, and then taking one's religious and ethnic identity seriously, and the tension that sometimes is caused by that. And I found that, and I think a lot of other people in MLI found that absolutely fascinating, because we hadn't realized that in many respects we were trying to do the same thing, which is negotiate religion while taking religion seriously and not belittling or dismissing its importance in our lives, but also taking secular reality very seriously. And so there were a lot of reasons why I wrote the book. One is I think I'm just a confessional person, and the way I deal with things that are in my head is by taking them out of my head and putting them out into the world. And another is I wanted to create something that did what I saw at Hartman within a Muslim language. And there's not really a lot of that, unfortunately. I have a very good friend who converted to Islam probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And I remember telling her she can't go to a mosque without my permission, because I was basically trying to protect her from really weird or crazy Muslims. Because when people convert, they're very vulnerable, right? Because suddenly their worldview has changed. And she often asked me, what can I read to learn more about being Muslim? And I was deeply disappointed that I didn't really have many directions to point her in. And at some point I thought, maybe I should write something that explores what this is like, and potentially that can be of benefit to people regardless of their background.
Great, thank you. We're gonna, I have a number of questions actually about your spiritual journey. One is you spend some time exploring other faiths and atheism, which you talk about in the book extensively, and you actually have one line here at the end that I'm hoping maybe you'll be willing to read to us. It's one of my favorite lines. It's at the end of the book. So if you can read it, and then I'll ask my question.
You want me to read the end of the book?
Just this one sentence.
Okay. I was I don't know, the whole chapter. Islam was no longer a straitjacket into which I forced myself, nor a non-native language I learned from others around me, but a grammar through which I vowed to write my own stories.
Great. I found that incredibly powerful, and I'm sure that others who have struggled with embracing and reclaiming their own heritage can identify with that and some of the themes throughout the book. Can you talk a little bit about why you ended up choosing Islam and the way in which you're writing your own Muslim stories, besides just this book, of course?
There will be more books. How to Still Be a Muslim. So there was a moment on when I was going with an MLI cohort last year, and it was 2 days in particular that really stuck out to me. And on one day we went to Ramallah, and I remember sitting in all places a barbershop with some MLI participants, and we were getting haircuts, because why not? And since I speak some Arabic, we were talking with the Palestinians who worked there, and very much like a barbershop, people come in and kind of just talk and chat, and it was a very cordial and convivial place. And at some level, as a Muslim, I deeply sympathized with and identified with them and what they were going through. And one of the barbers, my barber actually, and Ramallah is not far from Jerusalem, he's never been to Jerusalem. He's not allowed to go. So I remember internalizing that and thinking what that must be like. And then the next day we went to Tel Aviv. And I met with an editor at a newspaper I occasionally write for. And we met at a cafe near the beach. And I remember thinking to myself that I occupy a very strange place where I move between spaces and I'm conscious of the real and deep tensions between those spaces. But there's an aspect of that which is like a conjunction, an and instead of an or. And that's a difficult place to inhabit because, especially now, I think, in the United States and in other parts of the Western world, it's always you're one or the other. So there are real Americans and fake Americans, or there are white Americans and other kinds of Americans. And there's this increasing suspicion of cosmopolitan or complex identities. And I think, to get to your question, because I'm actually answering your question, I'm not a politician who just answers the question he wants to answer. For me, one of the reasons why I came back to Islam on different terms is because it allowed me to join together certain traditions I found deeply meaningful. And so in the Muslim tradition, Moses and Jesus are part of the tradition. And there's a way in which that's a conjunction. And that appealed to me because I identify as American and Muslim and Pakistani in different ways. And when I was younger, I sort of believed I had to be one or the other. And as I grew older, I realized that I actually want to incorporate different elements of these traditions so far as that's consistent or logical. And again, I think that goes back to Hartman, where I could appreciate the differences between the Jewish and Muslim tradition and benefit from those differences, while realizing that at some level they are obviously incompatible. You can't believe two things that are contradictory mutually.
Right. But
there was this element in Islam that I felt was allowing me to bring things together as opposed to pull myself apart. Yeah.
So as we explore your spiritual journey a little bit, and actually this idea of bringing things together and pulling apart, I'm curious about the entanglement of your spiritual challenges and mental illness that you talk about in the book, and a lot of the book felt like it was actually a disentangling of those two. I'm curious about what that process was like for you and where you are now in that journey.
So I was diagnosed bipolar when I was 23 years old. I don't want to say how old I am, but my hair loss probably reveals the passage of time. And when I first received the diagnosis, the language I had in my head was that this was a problem for other people. I also believed that it was evidence of some kind of spiritual defect, an insufficient or incomplete religiosity. And I know a lot of people of faith who internalize that or have that tendency. And it was to me like, well, you're far from God, so that must be why you have this problem. And it's not really a medical or psychiatric condition. It's a spiritual shortcoming that's manifesting itself in secular language. And so it was very hard for me to take that diagnosis seriously. When I finally started taking it seriously, oddly enough, that actually made it harder. Because when people who are bipolar tend to have coping mechanisms, and there's a book by a guy named Nasser Qaimi, which is fascinating. It's called On Depression. And I read it during a particularly bad moment in my life. And he said people who are bipolar tend to behave in several ways. So they're compulsively creative, they travel almost obsessively, they are prone to shopping binges, impulsive decisions, and they frequently get divorced, right? Which I guess more positively, they get married a lot. And I remember looking at that and thinking, and I was going through divorce. So I was like, wow, I literally check off all these boxes. There's just no travel binges because I'm broke. So that that is now, sorry, not shopping binges because I'm broke. And then the traveling was, again, I'm broke, so other people paid for me to travel. And that was actually really hard because it was, when you realize the coping mechanism, suddenly it doesn't help you cope anymore. Because you realize you're self-medicating. Right. And so you realize that what you're doing is actually preventing you from addressing what's actually happening. And then it's basically like you were standing on something and then you took it away. So you're just going to fall faster. And the final point I'll make that's really challenging about it actually occurred to me. I did a reading in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and
Recently.
yeah, about a month and a half ago. And someone in the audience was actually an old colleague of mine from graduate school, and I hadn't seen him in years, and he came out for the talk. And he raised his hand during question and answer, and he said, I don't actually have a question, which is something Muslims do at Muslim conferences. If you want to learn about Islam, you learn about the uncle who has a comment. It's always the first question. So I was like, okay, where's this going? And he said that his father was actually bipolar, but also schizophrenic. And he said that I watched my father suffer throughout his life, and I watched him cause other people to hurt because he was hurting. And at first I was like, okay, where is this going? This is not what I need to hear right now. But what he said is that, it takes a lot to deal with certain things, and obviously everyone has challenges. I'm not saying that I'm somehow unique. But the final point I'll say is that it also takes time to realize that this thing does not go away. That it's not simply like I had a depressive episode or I had a particularly bad time and it's over, and I addressed it and now I won't have these problems or these feelings or these tendencies, but it's actually always there. And perversely, when you do have if a person has a depressive episode, they're more likely to have another. So there's this way in which the problem compounds, and that is intimidating and something that one has to find a way to cope with. Yeah.
You also wrote about your experience around September 11th, when you were already at NYU and a leader at the Islamic Center. There's another passage in the book that I would love for you to read.
Okay.
It's here. It's marked here.
Sure.
It's this opening sentence, and then this paragraph, and then I'll ask my question.
Sure. My country had been attacked in my religion's name. Representing the Islamic Center became my life. I perceived my place in the community and the crisis in our country as fate working its ways. Because I was relatively well-read in Islamic history, and because in no small part thanks to my upbringing, I could hold my own at many of the events I was called to, I felt called. I did not give in, or seek to absolve myself of the burdens of the moment. But don't misunderstand me. I was no rabbi, priest, pastor, professor. I was a kid way over his head.
Yeah, it's a powerful paragraph. What was it like to be the spokesperson for Islam during that time, and how has it affected you?
So I was unusual among many South Asian Americans in that I was not pursuing a medical or engineering track. And I had decided to major in philosophy, and I took a lot of courses in Middle Eastern and Islamic studies. And sometime in my junior year, one of my professors said to me, you have enough credits for a double major, so why don't you just write a thesis in this as well, and you graduate with a double major? And I said, okay, fine. And so depending on where I'm applying to, I emphasize one or the other because it gives me street cred. And so I was comfortable in Islamic history, and I grew up in a family that took religious literacy very seriously. So unlike many people my age at that time or earlier, I not only was studying Arabic independently of school, but I knew how to, for example, give a Friday sermon. And a lot of Muslims wouldn't know how to do that. And so I felt like I had a responsibility towards the community given what I knew and what I was studying. And suddenly, after 9/11 happened, it felt like there was a reason I was in that position at that time, because unlike many people in the club, I was comfortable talking about these topics in a way that they would not be, because they didn't have the background. That said, I was 21 years old, and that's not really a point in your life where you really know much about yourself.
Right.
And you're navigating a really fraught environment that is charged with some really intense implications. And it was this weird space where I was scared that day as a New Yorker. I mean, who wouldn't be? Because something incredibly, an enormity had happened.
Yep.
And we had no idea if it was going to continue happening or what the scale or scope of it was. I remember that day in New York, people were talking about Pittsburgh and Seattle and Denver being attacked by planes, and you know, the rumor mill was churning. But the other part of it that was challenging was feeling like if I didn't intervene, things would get a lot worse. And that I placed on my shoulders this enormous responsibility to stop even worse things from happening. So I saw how several months after 9/11, during the run-up to the Iraq War, we used the memory of 9/11 to articulate a case for this war. And I remember being at the time 22 and thinking, this is a horrible idea, right? This is, I mean, whatever Saddam's sins and faults and flaws, of which there were many, invading Iraq seemed to be the worst thing possible. And it's a troubling feeling when you're 22 and you feel like you better understand what is going to happen than the people in power. And that whole time, you also realize you have no power. So no one's going to listen to what you're saying. And it was a tough position to be in.
And so you talk a lot about it as a calling. Do you feel like the work you're doing now, or that you have another calling now?
I think when I was younger, let me rewind that. A friend of mine said to me after a depressive episode, he said, it's time to stop worshiping religion and your community, and it's time to start worshiping God. And you spent a lot of time dedicated to the community and not much time dedicated to yourself. And perhaps it's a function of growing older or maturing or both of those things. But there is a point at which you realize, you know, this is probably, assuming I have a normal lifespan, the midpoint of my life. And so from here on out, for example, my knee just starts hurting. Right? The body no longer works quite.
It reminds you.
There was a card I saw. You know, you're getting older when your right knee and your left knee become your good knee and your bad knee. And so, and I'm not exaggerating that in trying to say this terrible thing, but I think that when I was younger, I fell into boxes more easily. Well, this must be a calling, and this must be what this moment means. And now I think I exist with a lot more complexity. But that said, I think that the work we're doing here is really groundbreaking, and probably alongside the Islamic Center, the most important thing I've done in my life. And such that I feel that at the end of my life, if I were to look back and say, did I do things that made a positive difference? This work with MLI and Hartman would probably be at the top of the list.
Great. So let's go there, because
no pressure.
MLI is the project that we work on together. We've made a few references to MLI. We're now starting to talk about the work. I think there are some people watching who probably know it intimately, and others who aren't yet familiar. You were part of the first cohort of the Muslim Leadership Initiative. So by way of explaining the program, why don't you also share with us a bit about your experience in that first cohort?
So MLI is modeled on other Hartman programs, and it brings North American Muslim leaders from very diverse perspectives, of course you know this, to Israel to study Judaism, Zionism, and Israel through Hartman faculty and staff, to experience the complexity and tensions in Israel, and also to encounter Palestinian narratives, so far as those are obviously part of the story in the region and are important and critical to the Muslim leaders themselves. So as a program, it's interesting because it's not a traditional interfaith or engagement program. It's kind of neat in that, and maybe it's an interesting model for other forms of dialogue across difference. Because normally, any kind of difference, Indian and Pakistani, perhaps we can say North Korean and South Korean, though I don't imagine there's that much dialogue happening there. Right, there's a more armed, airborne form of dialogue happening right now, coupled with tweets. So, but any sort of dialogue across difference usually ends up placing people in defensive positions where I'm more worried about articulating and defending my side than listening to you. And maybe one of the reasons why MLI has been so successful is because we kind of flip it on its head. Not only do we not avoid the elephants in the room, but we go straight at them. But we also make it a one-way conversation so that other people don't feel like they're forced to constantly articulate their side, right? They're allowed to be more complicated than just a talking point. For me, MLI was so interesting, and I mentioned earlier some of the complexities of what Hartman scholars do and the way in which they do it, and I found that deeply attractive and something I wanted to learn how to do within Muslim communities. But it was also interesting because, and here I'll quote Rabbi Hartman himself, when I asked him what surprised you the most about MLI, he said that we liked you. And I remember laughing, but I understood what he meant. And he didn't mean that I thought you would be terrible human beings and I would hate you. He meant that we were surprised at the degree to which we had found a connection.
Yeah.
Recently, probably a few months ago, I attended a conference between different faith traditions, and it was very nice. And we talked about our respective religious traditions, and we had a nice conversation. And yet I walked out thinking, I will never talk to these people again. Not because I had no interest in them, but I knew it it was just this 2-day standalone thing, and it was nice, and that was it. And my initial impression was that I'm going to go to Israel, and I'll learn more about Israel, and that's good because this is a significant gap in my knowledge, especially experiential knowledge. But I didn't imagine that I would have relationships and connections with people, and that was really surprising. And I think that's why MLI is so successful, is because at some level, if it's not too much to say, if I had been born Jewish, I would probably be at Hartman. And if someone who's Jewish is at Hartman and was born Muslim, they'd probably do MLI. Because it's not a matter of what is your identity or belief system, it is how do you approach the world. And when you find people who have like-minded approaches, again, going back to I take the wider world seriously, and I take myself seriously, and I take other people seriously, and I allow them to be complicated, and I allow our conversation to be complicated, that builds something that is very rare.
Yeah, I just joined 3 months ago, and I found had a similar experience, and appreciate all of the complexity and the transformation that you're articulating. It was also not without controversy, or it still continues to be with controversy, but in particular for you in the first cohort. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what that was like and how you actually made it through some of those attacks.
So the challenge of MLI is that you're bringing together Jews who identify strongly as Zionist, with obviously the incredible diversity of what that means, which was new to a lot of us because it was sort of like Zionism is this simple one-size-fits-all ideology and not one that's viewed positively or even engaged with. And MLIers are pro-Palestinian Muslims. And we realized that one of the reasons Muslim-Jewish dialogue doesn't go very far, it's because in North America, the mainstream of both communities are not talking to each other. Because mainstream North American Islam is very pro-Palestinian. It's almost like part of the core of community identity. And obviously mainstream American Judaism is Zionist. So now we're putting these people together in a room, which is a great idea. And yet, somehow we found this ability to say we are not going to agree on certain things, but we are going to agree on other things. We can understand the level of commitment to an identity even if we disagree with the implications of that commitment at times. But I think the most important thing for me, and this goes back to the book, is that, and everyone should buy the book just because it's awesome.
It is awesome.
It is. It's kind of awesome, and it's orange. And orange seems to be a popular color in power these days. So I went through a lot personally, and when I finally, and so this book ends before I did MLI.
Right. And
it almost lays the groundwork for MLI. If you read it that way, it's sort of like after everything I went through, I reached a point where I just didn't care anymore. I'd gone through so much. I lost my job. I basically lost my home. I lost all my money. I lost a marriage. I lost my mental health. I was suicidal. I went through all these things that someone trolling me over MLI was like, okay, that's great, right? Like this is not going to faze me. But I think and that's the sort of deeply internal condition that allowed me to push back against that. Another was this reflexive thing I have inside me that I don't like someone challenging me and questioning my identity or my loyalties. That just because I talk to someone means I am them. I find that problematic. But the thing I want to emphasize is, nothing else really seems to be working. And I don't mean that in terms of Israel-Palestine, although over there it seems like none of these initiatives are really going anywhere, but in terms of North American Jewish and Muslim communities. I think Muslim-Jewish dialogue is probably one of the most important interfaith dialogues of our time. And it's not where it could be in the US and Canada. And I don't think it's a good thing when communities with so much in common simply do not know how to talk to each other. And so whenever I got criticism of MLI that was more than trolling, I took it seriously and I listened to it and I talked to the people who are expressing it. But I always found myself thinking, well, what do you propose? What's your actual idea? If you have a better idea, I'm happy to listen to it. And if your idea is more successful than mine, then obviously I will be disappointed I picked the wrong idea. But to me, it's not that I'm right. It's that we accomplish something. And so if something else accomplishes that objective, then that's still good.
Right. And why is it so important for Muslim and Jewish communities to be talking to each other in America?
Well, I think in the United States, we're both minority communities. We have very similar religious traditions. We now face a common threat with the rise of some of these white supremacist movements. And so there's the element of vulnerability that has us in common. Then there's the element of opportunity that many of our specificities require us to work together. And so, for example, accommodations in the law to Jewish practice correspond to what Muslims need as accommodations, so dietary restrictions or things like that. And finally, I think there's benefit in learning from someone else. Like in and of itself, knowledge is valuable. And so learning about someone else and their tradition is a way of enlightening yourself and improving yourself as a person. But there's also sort of a utilitarian aspect to that. And I don't mean in a selfish sense, but if I learn about another tradition, particularly one that I think has been institutionally and religiously more mature in the US and Canada, I am also learning about myself and my community and able to say, well, maybe that idea would work in my community or maybe that idea wouldn't work in my community. And that's something I'd like to see more of in Muslim communities.
Great. We're about to open it up to questions. You've been on the road now for a few months doing your book tour. You already referenced one non-question that you received. I'm curious to hear what one favorite question is, one that you're always excited to be asked, and one maybe that frustrates you.
I don't know that I'm always excited to receive questions because ironically for someone who wrote a confessional book, I'm actually very introverted and shy, and I get very socially anxious. So whenever I have to read, you have to read a passage from the book, and I'm gripped by sheer terror. I'm reminded of the cover story in The Atlantic, My Age of Anxiety, and I can channel a little bit of that because it's like you're bearing your soul to complete strangers and then inviting them to ask questions about your life. I find the questions tend to be in one of two categories. Either it's very political, so people who maybe have never met a Muslim, and yet obviously Islam is on their minds because of the news, and so they're just eager to ask questions they have no one else to ask them of. And I don't begrudge that at all. I think it's a moral responsibility when you know something to share something. And then the second are the more intimate personal questions. Some of my questions have been, I think, so the more interesting questions are from people who have very different backgrounds and yet are looking for threads in common. And so there was a reader from Canada who said he grew up as an atheist and yet said that he identified with many of the questions in the book. And that was interesting because obviously this is to refer to the passage that I read, the first passage, there is a Muslim grammar here. But in a Muslim grammar, I write a human story.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Definitely. Definitely. Great.
We have more questions.
Let's see what,
and I'm gonna Marco Rubio this.
Let's see what, great. While I read through these questions, you can have a sip of water.
I've had several.
You didn't even need me to read through the questions. Okay, so there's a number of questions, it looks like, on the topic of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community and how it can be addressed. The way this one's worded is that, especially given the virulent words that were reported to have been said by imams in California recently, given the recent tensions in Jerusalem, how can anti-Semitism be combated most effectively in the Muslim community?
So there is definitely a problem with anti-Semitism in Muslim communities. I don't think it's as bad in North America as it is in many parts of the Muslim majority world. Partly that's because I think living in a democratic culture, we have more exposure to difference. People tend to actually encounter Jewish institutions and narratives. For a lot of people in the Muslim world, they're never going to meet someone of that background. So it's easy to inhabit a caricature. How you combat that, I think there's several ways, two of which maybe are immediately relevant. The first is something like MLI. So I've become, through MLI, much more aware of the ways in which anti-Semitism functions, because it's different to approach something afar and say, well, I know objectively that this is a problem or that this exists, and it's very different when you know someone personally through a deep relationship and exchange of ideas and emotions to think about how that is received. And there's an ability to understand that kind of discrimination or bias on a different level. So that kind of exposure, I think, is really valuable. I'm going to add a third at the end because I'm allowed to do that. The second is, and this is something I often encourage Muslims to do, and there is an element of self-interest in this, is that obviously a lot of Muslims are worried about Islamophobia, which is a real thing. There was a bomb at a mosque in Minnesota a few days ago. It was a terrorist attack, and nobody was talking about it. And you know, with this fear of Islamophobia, there is this tendency to become insular because you're afraid for a community. And that happens to anyone.
Everyone.
If I see a threat to my community, I'm just suddenly, all I can see is that threat. And so what I often encourage Muslim communities to do is to involve their young people in tracking and studying bias incidents against other faith communities or other ethnic and racial communities. Because one, it makes them see they're not alone in this situation. Two, it allows them to build relationships which benefit both communities. And three, it makes them aware of those incidents on a deep level that they might not otherwise be aware of. And the final point is, and this is a perverse reality, but sometimes there's a silver lining, with the rise of hate groups and the language of people in power that we see, suddenly a lot more Muslims see anti-Semitism. And so this is something that's, I think, sometimes hard for Muslim audiences to understand. Because a lot of Muslims would say, well, one is they didn't see the anti-Semitism, because unless you're looking for it, you're not going to see it. And anti-Semitism was deeply socially unacceptable in America on a general level. People responded to it rightly very negatively. And so it existed more in darker corners, and now it's coming out and it's emboldened. And so when it existed in darker corners, people didn't quite see it as much. But a lot of Muslims struggled with this because they would say, well, you know, look, Hillary Clinton has family members who are Jewish, Donald Trump has family members and Jewish. How can there be an anti-Semitism problem if so many people in different positions of power not only work with Jewish communities, but themselves have relatives who are Jewish? So where is the anti-Semitism? Jewish communities are so institutionally mature and plugged in. And so a few things happened. The first was suddenly they saw it because now it's more open with a lot of these white supremacist groups, and it's like, oh, clearly this did not, it exists, and more so, clearly this didn't pop up overnight.
Right.
Like this was there, it was festering, and now it's a little bit more visible than it was a year or two ago. But also, and this is a question I pose to Muslim audiences when I ask them about what they think about bias against other communities. And I say, look, imagine our community survives this moment in time and prospers. I don't think it's that serious that we're not going to survive. I mean that we get through this and we prosper. And in 20 or 30 years, we're a very successful, integrated community that is seen as a positive contributor to American life, that we have robust religious life, that we're flourishing. Do you think Islamophobia would go away? Or in a pernicious sense, would it get worse? Because suddenly the hatred people feel for a minority that is vulnerable turns into a hatred and envy of a minority that is more powerful, that is successful. And a lot of Muslim audiences will pause and understand what it is I'm saying. That just because you're doing well for yourself doesn't mean that people don't hate you. It might mean that it's harder for them to say certain things because of power dynamics, right? And we have rightly in this country driven a lot of these groups to the margins. But you know, as they come back out, those ideas were already there. They're just broadcasting them. So I think there's a lot of ways in which Muslims can confront anti-Semitism. I also think that social circumstances right now make it easier to do that, which is why the work of MLI is so important, and we should capitalize on this moment to allow people to see some of these common struggles.
As part of your work at the Hartman Institute, you now teach Jewish audiences, rabbis, others in the Jewish community about Islam. What are messages that you make sure that they hear? What are things that you think that it's really important for the Jewish community to know about Muslims in America?
When MLI first brings North American Muslims to Israel to study, in the first few days, some of the leading Hartman scholars do this thing where they lay out kind of the broad outlines of Judaism. And it can be very confusing for Muslim participants because they're like, well, when are we going to get to the hard stuff? Or why are we talking in such general terms? And one thing that always blows the Muslim mind away or troubles the Muslim mind is this idea, and I don't know quite how to articulate it, so I apologize if I screw it up, that Jewish identity is both religious and ethnic. Right. And there's an interplay between these things. And so I think we called it, the covenant at Sinai and then the covenant in sort of the line of Abraham, right? So there's a sense that you were born Jewish and you're always Jewish. It's like an ethnic identity. You can't un-Jewish yourself no more than I can un-Pakistani myself. So these two things don't exist necessarily in tension, but they challenge what we mean by religion because religions aren't the same in the sense that what I mean by religion, even within a Muslim community, can be completely different. But within traditions, there's a very different idea of what is a religion supposed to be. So I've actually very much borrowed, I think, that model to say what are the overarching themes in Islam. And I get to these ideas that in the Islamic tradition are almost like our grammar, out of which everything makes sense. So the idea of prophecy, the idea of monotheism, the idea of repentance, the idea of a caliphate, which is not, by the way, the caliphate that we're talking about now in the Middle East, but this idea of every human being's agency in the world, and this idea of a vision of religion that connects Adam to Muhammad, and saying that once you understand these really big picture concepts, you can begin to fill in the gaps. And I shy away from rites and rituals and the granular stuff, because that doesn't let you see what it means to be a Muslim and how Muslims see the world. And the concepts that we fight over, sometimes violently, that animate our religious life. So that is, I think, one of the goals I have in trying to give someone a deeper grasp of a different tradition. And then, of course, we have to address terrorism and extremism because those are pertinent topics and of personal interest to a lot of people. And finally, the statistics, the diversity of American Islam, the diversity of modern day Islam, and showing people the incredibly rich cultural life that exists within Muslim traditions to get them beyond this caricature of all Muslims are one thing or all Muslims believe one thing.
Another question from the audience. Do you think there are parallels between acculturation of Muslim and Jewish immigrants to the U.S.? If so, what are the similarities and differences?
That is a huge question.
Huge question. Take it anywhere you want to go.
It's an excellent question. So one of the challenges that I hear a lot in Jewish communities, and more so among Ashkenazi communities, but from what I understand, American Jews are overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, is are Jews white? And if so, what are the moral implications of that? And what does that mean for an ethnic identity that one can identify with the mainstream? And at some level, yes, Jews are white. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are not seen as non-white individuals, obviously. And so that is interesting because it poses a stark contrast to Muslims in North America. America is unique among almost all Western countries except Eastern Europe in that we have a significant percentage of, for lack of a better term, indigenous Muslims, the black Muslim experience. You don't have that in nearly the same way in Canada or Britain or France, where you have this deeply rooted local population that is Muslim. So Sherman Jackson, who's a scholar of Islam, he often points out there's only two kinds of people in America who are never asked where they're from: white people and black people. If you're brown or you're Asian, then there's this, well, where are you really from? When did you get your green card? That was a shout out. Sometimes only one person watching needs to understand. So that African American Muslim experience makes our community unique among other Muslim communities. And the most famous Muslims in America, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Dave Chappelle, Malcolm X, Barack Obama, they're all black Muslims. All of them are totally Muslim. Barack, I feel like he's waiting till enough time has passed that he can finally out himself, but we all know. But the point being that when Americans think of Islam, even sometimes they don't realize who Muslims are. And so when Americans think of Islam, they think of this foreign thing, and then you'll say, well, what about Muhammad Ali? Or what about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Shaquille O'Neal or something like that, like people who identify in part or in whole as Muslim or part of a Muslim tradition. So, and then alongside that, the second stream is Muslims of recent immigrant origin. And what makes that different from Jewish communities is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the United States are people of color. And that, and I think that kind of marginalization in a much more severe form existed early in American Jewish history, when, for example, you had huge Jewish communities in Manhattan and other parts of New York that were clearly marginalized. And obviously a lot of time has passed since then, so a lot of acculturation took place. But the majority of Muslims in America have roots here going back to maybe the 60s, usually the 70s and 80s. So we haven't been here that long. And although we exist in a post-civil rights era, there is still obviously a consequence of being a person of color. And so that, I think, is really a big difference, because religions aren't just what you believe, it's who you are. If the majority of Muslims, for example, in the world lived in South America, Islam would be a completely different kind of religion and probably more fun. But it's not that fun to be Muslim right now. So that is something that in American Islam I think gets overlooked. And going back to the previous question from the audience, I like to make my students think about is how is this going to play into Jewish-Muslim relations? And how do these anxieties about whether you belong and who thinks you belong affect Muslim communities? And that goes to, and I want to loop back to this because I'm sure people are thinking about this, how Muslims see Israel and Palestine. Yeah. Most Muslims in the world are either colonized now or descendants of recently colonized people, or subjected to wars by usually Western or imperial powers, which produces this deep skepticism and mistrust of anything that identifies itself as Western. And so Israel is seen as a Western state, and so conflated or collapsed into the wider West and not seen for its distinctiveness in many ways. And so that makes a lot of these conversations really challenging because they trigger very strong feelings that may not be made explicit, but they're right there under the surface.
Great. I think that brings us in some ways to the next question.
Awesome.
Someone wrote in that you mentioned that if you were born Jewish, you'd be at the Hartman Institute. You were born Muslim and you are at the Hartman Institute. Can you talk a little bit about...
I never thought about it that way. And there goes my whole line. Now I have to change this.
Can you talk about what it's like to be Muslim working at a Zionist institution?
I feel like I can get away with a lot because no one can challenge me. Like, oh, I have to go pray again. And then it gets really awkward. Like, can we tell the Muslim that he needs to go back to work? But it's interesting because it's nice to be in an environment where I'm different in a very significant way. And I don't mean that in the sense that I've been made to feel different, but that I'm conscious of this difference. And so it is a learning experience. It is obviously at times emotionally challenging, and there are political and ideological implications that go into that. A few colleagues at Hartman and I often have debates over, well, how are we supposed to solve Israel-Palestine? And we have very different views of what that should look like. And so as an example of this, I think pretty much everyone at Hartman that I know of believes in a two-state solution. And I believe in a one-state binational solution. I don't see a two-state solution happening. So I believe in a sort of egalitarian, single state. And we often have these debates, but I will say two things about that. The first is they never ever even remotely cross into you shouldn't say that. It's more a collegial debate among people who see themselves as partners in a conversation. Well, this is why I think this, and someone who's a two-stater will say, well, your idea is maybe naive, or fails to account for this, or fails to account for my identity as a Zionist and what I want to see. And so there's this back and forth, but it's a productive back and forth where I can respect and acknowledge this person's differences and have a conversation based on that. And what it goes back to and I wanted to connect to, and what I really like about being here is that it, in a much bigger sense, it gets to one of the biggest challenges in American life, which is that we now have this tendency to think that because someone has a different opinion than us, that they are bad people.
Yep.
And what MLI forces you to do, maybe forces is the wrong word, inculcates in you, encourages, draws out in a very positive sense, is very good people can have different commitments, and yet they are animated by shared values. Nobody doesn't want peace. Nobody doesn't want their communities or the region to flourish. Nobody is looking to harm anyone else. But there are questions of, are there harms to my community? Are there dangers to my community? What does it look like to flourish? What are the conditions for peace? What is the most realistic path to peace? But, and this is what I like about this work and goes to what it's like to work here, is that the values underlying the conversations are shared. And as long as we can acknowledge those values, the debates never go to the point of acrimony. And I think it'd be no different in some ways than the healthcare debate in the US, where someone might actually believe that single payer is the only way to address this reality, and someone may believe that the free market is the only way to address that reality. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily motivated by any sort of ill will or malevolence, far from it. They just believe that the best way to do this is different than I believe or you believe. And I would like to see that in Muslim-Jewish conversations generally, is we might disagree, but that has no bearing on our moral quality and our dignity as people.
Great. That also answered another question.
Awesome.
Or multiple questions that came in around how do you bring people with divergent views to the table together, not only around this issue, but generally what you've learned about it. So if there's anything else you want to add to that question.
One of the reasons that MLI was so controversial in Muslim communities is because, well, nobody knew what Hartman was. And there was a tendency to assume that Hartman was an advocacy organization that took political positions, which Hartman does not. And very few people realize that Hartman speaks to a very broad spectrum of the Jewish community and engages diverse Jewish identities and acknowledges them as serious differences. So when you don't see something as an educational institution, you think it's an advocacy organization, you say, well, why are Muslims going to this institution? What is Hartman's intention? And so on and so forth. And so in terms of animating these conversations, one of the things that's been really successful, and we've talked about this a lot, is learning side by side. What was so appealing about MLI, and there were many panels like this, where we would have 3 or 4 either American Jewish or Israeli Jewish panelists, and they would start arguing with each other. And there was no attempt to pretend like there weren't tensions. It was very clearly not Potemkin village tour of Israel. It was very obviously not an attempt to hide any dirty laundry. It was a very forthright conversation. And I remember, for example, one where an American Jew had made Aliyah said, I can only really be Jewish in Israel. And the American Jew sitting next to him clearly rolled his eyes, right? It was like, I don't believe
I am Jewish in America.
Right. So, but it was interesting because there was no attempt to say this tension doesn't exist. And Muslim participants reciprocated that and said, well, we have tensions too. And maybe there's this tendency in two-way dialogue to say, well, no, I can't air that dirty laundry, even though everyone can already see it. So you don't think that I'm an honest interlocutor. You think that I'm some kind of political operative or I have an agenda. And so what I find is that learning side by side about one's own traditions and the tensions in them encourages reciprocal honesty. When I'm honest with you, you want to be honest with me. And actually, I saw that with the book. So many people come up to me after a reading and say, I'm struggling with the same thing. Because when one person has the ability to say, look, I have a lot of stuff in my life that's not working, and I've had a lot of struggles, and it's not easy, other people in the audience will say, well, maybe I'm not alone, and maybe I should talk about this.
Wow, that's powerful, yeah.
You skipped that question entirely.
Here's one. I totally skipped that one.
That was not.
Totally skipped it.
We should do the fun questions
but
too.
Here's one. When are you coming to Kansas City?
Whenever I am invited. Actually, what I will say is, I have this. We all have dumb goals that animate our life. I want to go to all 50 states. Okay. And I've been to.
Tell everyone where you have not been.
I have not. So I don't want to name 14 states. That would be really boring for people, especially if I missed one. That would just be embarrassing. And so I flew to Ohio last week.
Congratulations.
And Cincinnati International Airport is in Kentucky. And I've never been to Kentucky. So I got to go to Kentucky.
There you go.
And if this is Kansas City and Kansas, I've never been to Kansas.
Okay.
So I'm not only willing to go to Kansas, it would help me fulfill something that at the end of my life would make me feel like my life had greater meaning than it probably did.
Great. Well, hopefully those listening and watching will be able to help you fulfill
Inshallah.
this dream. Let's see what else is in here. Oh, here's one. I am a public school teacher in New Jersey. My school is receiving many Muslim refugee students. How can I help them be proud of who they are, given today's political climate?
There was a great article in the New York Times about books written about Muslim refugees for children. And what the article...
you posted it on your...
I did post it on my Facebook wall. And what the article... And it's easy, you just type in New York Times refugee children story. And what was so interesting is that the article basically starts off with this landscape, or survey of the landscape, and says nobody was telling these stories. And so a lot of authors have stepped up and written pieces about what it's like to be a Muslim and a refugee. And I think that immediately comes to mind as a resource because they're designed for kids and they're a way of identifying. And I will say that seeing yourself in a story is one of the most powerful ways to feel like you're part of something. When Muslims read this book especially and say, oh, someone's talking about mental illness from a Muslim language, that makes me feel like I'm not alone and that my own story deserves to be heard and more importantly, deserves to be addressed.
Right. Great. So we're going to wrap up in just a few minutes. I'd love to close if you could share a story that keeps you motivated, preferably from MLI. Sometimes this work can be incredibly challenging, and I'd love to hear what resources you draw on, what stories you remember in order to keep you motivated.
I don't know if I'm supposed to share this story.
Uh-oh.
So if I get in trouble, we can't edit it. Maybe I'm less likely to get fired because I'm Muslim. So, but it would be a great way to go out. We had a panel on the first cohort, and the first trip. So each cohort is, as you know, 2 trips to Israel, about a year apart. And we had a panel the second to last day, and it did not go well. One of the panelists was a former MK from a very right-wing party, and one of the panelists was very active in the settler movement. And it was a very charged conversation. People left the room. At one point, one of the participants asked what's supposed to happen with the refugees in places like Gaza, and the MK said, well, you know, once you've been a refugee for a few generations, you should just suck it up. And he was like, doesn't that kind of invalidate the entire narrative of coming home after a long time of being in exile? But she didn't process that. And I, was having this back and forth with the settler. And I remember saying, and I was trying to explain that I'm not saying this from a hostile place. What I was saying is that when you don't address a deep wound in your society, at some point it boils up. And it's no different than the Arab Spring. I mean, a lot of these governments were ignoring certain tensions in their society, thinking that they would just go away. And there's this narrative in Israel right now that this is all under control and it's not going to be a problem. But unless you address people's frustrations and anger, and within Jewish or Palestinian communities, eventually it's going to come back and bite you. And so I was trying to say that, his position was untenable. He thought I was threatening him or something of the kind, and so it was not going very well. And then he analogized me to a suicide bomber. It was just a very awkward conversation. And people left the room. I think one person started crying, and then the moderator was like, why don't we wrap this up? Because this is clearly not, And afterwards, there was at the Institute, there was a concert by a group of Israelis who kind of mine spiritual texts for contemporary music.
Yeah.
And we went to listen to this performance, but everyone's head was like in the panel. And one of the senior Hartman faculty left the panel and told me that he was going to a family function of a very powerful Israeli politician. And so he left and he said, well, I'll see you off at the airport tomorrow. And it was a weird moment because everyone knew, I think everyone, this was an experiment. So I think everyone was like, is that the end of MLI? That was a really great way to go. And then about half an hour later, I was sitting on the grass and we were listening to the music, or trying to. And suddenly he came and sat down next to me. And he
was
said,
supposed to be at the wedding.
and he was supposed to be at the wedding. And this was a very important Israeli figure. It wasn't just like some random person he doesn't even know. And so it was obviously very important for him to be there. And he came and sat down next to me and he said, I wanted to make sure you were okay.
Wow.
And that was more important to me than a wedding for a politician that at the end of the day I don't care about as much. Because to me this program feels like it's important. And that's not to say that the wedding wasn't important, but it was like in that moment emotionally he felt like he had to do something. So he came back, and I think he went back to the wedding eventually, but he came back just to be like, I understand what happened, and I know that that was an argument and that there were reasons for the argument, but I want you to know that on a personal level I care about how you're feeling. And to me that was the moment when I realized we were doing something different and that we were actually building relationships that a lot of people would have probably thought impossible, because many Muslim-Jewish dialogues encounter that moment where they fall apart and they never have the next moment, and that's the difference.
Wow, what a powerful way to end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Haroon, thanks for spending the hour with me and with everyone watching.
Thank you for awesome questions.
Great. Thanks.